Hey guys, how's it going? Kripparrian here. Today I want to bring you guys a build guide for the build I've been playing in Diablo 4 for Season 1. Now, I got to Season 1 a little bit late because I was traveling in New Zealand, but I wanted to give you guys this guide because while Season 1, we're in the middle of it, it didn't change the end game or too many of the goals of what you have in an end game character. So not a lot of people played Season 1 for a really long time, but I know a lot of you guys are still playing and you guys want to try some of the builds that I've been playing, and I have some pretty cool builds coming up for you guys. We're going to have a few build guides, and more importantly, it kind of gives an idea about what we can expect in the future for the class. Today I'll be covering the Shadow Minion build that I've been playing for Necromancer, and I think it's important to talk about minions in the non-Ring of Mendeln era, because when people talk about minion builds right now, they're all compared to the Mendeln builds, which uses your character's damage, so it's a completely different build setup. And the Ring of Mendeln builds are entirely focused around Bone Prison providing infinity lucky hit. So you have a proc that does damage based on the Necro, and it's tied to the lucky hit rate, and there's still a bugged ability in the game that has infinity lucky hit. So, look guys, the gravy train on infinity lucky hit Mendeln builds, it's going to run out one day. I'm blown away that it hasn't run out yet. But if you want to play an actual minion build that uses actual scaling for minions, you've come to the right place. As always, Kripp builds are on Mobalytics. If you want to check out what I'm playing, what I have up there, it's going to be in the written format on Mobalytics, and the link will be below for that if you want to see this build and my other builds. So this is a build that I played on softcore this time around just because I wanted a clean run through. I didn't want to have to reroll if I died, but it's largely based on the hardcore Golemancer that I played at the end of the preseason, and that build was possibly one of the very best hardcore builds you can play, period. So while there are a few compromises to take away from the maximum survivability of what's possible in a minion build, it doesn't take that much away. And with that in mind, I think this build is absolutely viable for hardcore play still. So, what are we running? We are running Bone Storm, and we have this with a few aspects, as we'll go over in a second. We're running Reap. If you're playing hardcore, you basically have to run Blood Mist instead of Reap. It doesn't change a lot. We're running Raised Skeletons with both the Skeletons and the Mages. The Corpse Tendrils, of course, to apply Vulnerable. Corpse Explosion is a new addition, and that's because this is a Shadow build, and we're using Shadow Corpse Explosion, and those procs help us go with Shadow Blight. And honestly, I wouldn't even bother using Corpse Explosion if not for the Malignant Gem here, which is Sacrilegious. Walking near a corpse automatically activates an equipped corpse skill every second. Does reduce damage, but we don't care that much. This is just to help a little bit of AoE, but it's also to get the procs. And other than Corpse Tendrils, it's the only corpse skill on the bar. Now, that one will prioritize Corpse Tendrils. It'll also prioritize, even before Corpse Tendrils, to resummon Skeletons, but the Skeletons just stop dying in the higher levels. Once you have everything running, it's not a problem. It won't cast the Raised Skeleton Priest, like if you have all your skeletons, so you still have to do that, and that's really important because even though most builds across the board were nerfed for Season 1, Minion Necro was nerfed one of the least, and in the case of Raised Skeleton, the Skeleton Priest buff is actually 30% instead of 20%. They nerfed crit damage, which we never used as minions. They nerfed vulnerability, which we took a little bit of a hit, but they buffed the Raised Skeleton. Minion Necro is for real. Blizzard has actually been giving it attention, and it is very much around the power level of most good builds. We use Corpse Explosion just because of that. Once that gem goes away, I'd probably not use Corpse Explosion because we use it fairly infrequently. And the Golem. In terms of the actual minions, we're using skeleton warriors to pop off corpses. This is very important to enable corpse mechanics. We're using the shadow skeleton mages, and this is the main center point of the build. I have been a huge advocate for cold skeleton mages in the past, but that has recently changed, as in one of the last updates, they made these shadow mages fire an additional bolt. Instead of every 6th attack, it's now every 4 attacks. They've also fixed the bug where shadow mages can stack Shadow Blight, which is super important. They actually proc Shadow Blight. I think it procs their own Shadow Blight, but it's still a lot of extra damage, a lot of extra hits, and a lot of higher uptime on your blighted aspect. And we're using the Bone Golem, which is kind of the Golemancer tech that I've utilized in the Hardcore Necromancer of preseason. The Bone Golem's auto attack is a cleave, and it is fantastic AoE clear if you invest a little bit in the Golem's damage, which of course we will. Now, in that build, I originally used this one for a little bit more life and thorns because I figured the golem never really takes 20% of its life and damage. The thing is damn immortal. You never even see its life go down once you have the whole setup going. Now, the thing is that it actually seems to proc a fair amount, and I believe it's so because it might be proccing off of the base life of the golem or something of that sort. There's also a lot of bugs with skills in Diablo 4, so it wouldn't surprise me that it's just bugged. But it's certainly better than just increasing your thorns damage from like 100 to 140. That's not really going to make a difference. So definitely you want to be going with that. In terms of the rest of the skill setup, so we have the Reap. We just go for Hewed Flesh, nothing special. Only 1 point in Corpse Explosion. Again, it's not really contributing that much damage from the Corpse Explosion itself. It's just nice to get a few extra hits and coverage for our other passives and abilities. We want to have 1 point in Thorns if you don't have any on your gear, and you probably shouldn't have any on your gear. The Skeleton Warrior Mastery, Grim Harvest. We actually don't use a single ability that consumes essence. We have Decrepify, but we have it as an aura. Fueled by Death, a little bit of extra damage. We get Decrepify, even though you can activate Decrepify with the jewelry gem. We want to have Abhorrent Decrepify to reduce our cooldowns, and that is a lucky hit based thing, so it's nice to get a little bit of lucky hit, but again, not as important. Deal extra damage to cursed enemies, Skelly Mage, Death's Embrace. I'm not sure if the close enemies take more damage works on your minions. It might, but if it does, it's probably 30% of that, so it's pretty irrelevant. We mostly get that for the defensive aspect. We only get 1 point in Corpse Tendrils because it's automatically using the Corpse Tendrils with the gem quite often, and it uses it on a 6-second cooldown that disregards the actual cooldown of the skill. While when that gem goes away, and Blizzard said those gems are going to go away after Season 1, it still might not be necessary to have quite the full 5 points in the Shadow build. You'll notice that the points get a little bit tight, because with the Shadow build you want to get Reaper's Pursuit, as movement speed is a premium for Necromancers. Gloom is an incredibly large amount of damage, and Terror is also an incredibly large amount of damage. Shadow gets a lot of damage. We get the Golem Mastery, the full Bone Storm, and I actually skipped points in Bonded in Essence because my minions were really never dying. Now, if we were to go to like Nightmare Dungeon 100 type of thing, it might be a case for going Army of the Dead to just summon them constantly, or maybe the healing is enough, but I think that will be based on your playstyle, how aggressively you're pushing through those mobs, and generally the gear and overall survivability of the character. We're using Shadow Blight, and Shadow Blight does a lot of the damage and activators for the character, but more importantly, because we're not using Kalan's Edict, we don't really care about getting hit. If we get hit, it's not a big deal. We're usually not even going to take damage. And that changes the playstyle of this Necromancer compared to the original Golemancer that I had. In terms of a lot of the AoE damage, also going to come from the Barber. The Barber is a fantastic gem for minions. The minions can proc it themselves, and they can stack it themselves, and it really helps the AoE damage. We're actually not going to use the Golem glyph, as I'll show you in a second, just because we have the Barber. There are other Wrathful gems, but the Barber's definitely the best one for a summoner. Skull and weapons, we actually really want the life on kill, and we really want to use a sight specifically because life on kill does go to your minions. It just constantly keeps them topped off if you're doing similar level content. I like to use topazes if I don't use blood mist, and I like to use rubies if I do use blood mist and I'm hanging back. If I'm likely to get crowd controlled pretty often, I really like topaz for necromancer. And because we have the decrepit aura gem, so we have decrepify, it's an aura, it's pretty big around your character, but it's not really going to work if you sit back. This build, you kind of got to get in the action a little bit. Now, there are the overall attributes that you're going for on gear, but the requirements are fairly low. I actually think survivability stats are more important than cooldown reduction for this build because, for corpse tendrils, the cooldown is bypassed. The only ability that we really use that has a cooldown is Bone Storm, and Bone Storm is usually most important if there's lots of monsters around, but if there's lots of monsters around, you're going to have a really easy time reducing Bone Storm's cooldown with the Decrepify cooldown reduction procs from all the hits that you're doing. I really like the bubble aspect for Necromancer because it prevents you from getting chain one-shot from like frozen abilities, which is how I lost my highest level character in Hardcore, and that was a bit of a mess, but you have some flexibility to use a utility or other defensive aspect on the helmet. We still use Disobedience for armor. Blighted aspect increases your overall damage, and this seems to work on your minions 1-to-1. This is tooltip damage, so it's not just the shadow damage of your mages, this is all your damage. So this character is going to be doing much higher single target than the Cold Skeleton defensive version of the build, just because the shadow mages are doing so much more damage. But also when blighted aspect goes off, and that's largely why we have corpse explosion, it's going to go off and vastly increase the damage for that time period. The uptime for this build is going to be based on how many monsters are around, but a lot of the time when it's just single target, on the first proc the target is going to die. Shielding Storm is actually significantly buffed as barrier acquisition now works off of your total health, not your base health. However, at this current point in the game, it seems like the maximum barrier is still based on your base health. But this basically means that if you have a good roll on the Shielding Storm, you have Bone Storm up, and there's several mobs around you, it becomes impossible to die with this character, which is pretty nice. We have Skelly Warriors in the boots. Boots can be utility. We have Frenzy Dead in the two-hander. The attack speed is really hard to scale. The tooltip in the game says that minions get 30% of your attack speed. That's not true. They currently don't do that. I believe 30% of your attack speed becomes minion attack speed, and 30% of minion attack speed becomes the attack speed of each minion. The only way to actually increase attack speed of your minions 1-to-1 is to increase the attack speed of a specific minion. Like on the Paragon tree, as you'll quickly see in a moment, we have Golem attack speed skilled in. That will actually work in its fullest value. So there's not a lot of things that increase the attack speed of your minions, really. And the aspect of Frenzy Dead does do that. So I really like to get this on the two-hander. I also like to get mages on the amulet. It's another body out there. It's more procs. It's just, it's a lot of extra little things. Like, yeah, I think you may get a little bit more damage if you put like blighted aspect on the amulet. You can swap those if you want, but I just like having an extra mage. Mage on amulet has been my go-to. In terms of passives on the amulet, there's quite a few options for the shadow-based summoner. I think Hellbent Commander is still probably the best one, but there's a lot of options with that. Reanimation was buffed. It used to be max 30, now is 40. And I really like to use Shadow Bone Storm. So Shadow Bone Storm does a lot of things that people aren't really too aware of. So your Bone Storm hits a lot of times, just even if you don't have this, it hits a lot of times. It lasts 10 seconds, and another Bone Storm that's also your damage happens revolving around your golem. Now, when you use the Shadow Bone Storm aspect, your Bone Storm initial damage becomes Shadow, and it does a damage over time. Now, this damage over time, unlike all other damage over times, actually only ticks once per second, but you have one and your golem also has one. So effectively, it multiplies the number of hits by 3, but it also increases the damage quite substantially, and it does a really good job of just deleting all like the little spiders and stuff. And you might be thinking, yeah, those don't really matter. Now that's true, but this build, in terms of its comparison to other minion builds, really excels in single target damage. So if you can get rid of all the garbage monsters quickly, you're going to start to see your clear speed go up substantially. Now, I have used the extra duration on Bone Storm in the past, but it really messes up because it's constantly using corpses that you actually are trying to utilize with your own skills, and there's no automatic corpse targeting unless you're using a controller. If you're using a controller, you can use that aspect, but if you're not using a controller, the aspect of Ultimate Shadow actually increases the duration of Bone Storm by 2 seconds because it's still doing damage over time after the original Bone Storm has ended, so you get a little bit of that as well. Also, because it triples the hits, it very literally multiplies the effect of Shielding Storm by 3. So it's like having 3 of these in one. So it does a lot for that. And it does a fantastic job of stacking armor. It'll stack the new 30% instead of 50% armor just by itself on single target with your golem. So it's huge for that. And you're going to get your blighted aspect just instantly, even against single target, because it's doing so many hits, and all those hits are shadow. In terms of Paragon, there are a few changes that I have made to this build specifically. So I tried to account for the fact that they lowered the amount of armor you can get on a character. Now, armor is just as broken as ever in terms of the formula. Hopefully it's something they address in Season 2. They said they would address it, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be addressed in the way that you like. Right now, armor is super premium, so I chose to use glyphs that would buff the armor nodes, even if the glyph bonuses themselves weren't too powerful. You're going to have some nearby corpses. Are you going to have 6 nearby corpses? Probably not, but I think it's pretty good still. We're using Dead Razor in the cult leaderboard. That is just super standard. Another one that's pretty standard is the Mage Glyph. Remember, if we get like minion damage, your Scalons are only going to get 30% of that. I hope that's a bug, but until that is addressed, you have to use the glyphs for the minions that you're trying to pump damage from. And those mages, those shadow mages, are doing tons of damage. So we're using the shadow mage glyph there. We're investing in golem, but we're not using the golem glyph because we have a lot of extra AoE from just minute sources, but also our single target is much higher, so it's contributing a little bit to AoE as well. But because we're not using the golem glyph, I still opted to get all the golem passives just to get a little bit of clear from the golem itself. I went back to using Amplify and the Scent of Death board. You know why? That's right, more armor. I want that armor back. And I decided to finish in the Flesh Eater board up here, linked from the Cult Master, and I'm using Exploit. So Exploit, it has a few extra dexterity nodes there. There's some flex nodes. I actually really like to leave a few extra points because, you know, some people might be like, you know, I don't really care for those health points. I want to try to go for another short area, like you can go for Skeleton Warrior. So I'd like to leave it a little bit flexible, not to the T. And let's be honest, a lot of us, once we hit level 100, we're just making another character. But maybe your next character will be this one, and I hope you've enjoyed the build guide for it.